Okay, so I'm recording this. I'll share it later. Thanks everybody for logging in. Like I said last week, we talked about early American history from uh, the transition between the colonies and the United States of America, and how the Constitution um, is the blueprint for that government. They could have designed any type of government that they wanted, but they had a certain thing in mind. So the foundational idea that you got to remember, everything with the Constitution, and when you think back and what did they mean, what did they want, what was going on, they knew they were breaking away. They declared independence from a monarchy, a king, where one person has all the power. Now, Britain had a parliament, which is a little bit different. It's not just one king, but basically, they were breaking away from a monarchy where one person has all the power. Here, we're going to cover the other two branches of government, and then we're going to talk about checks and balances, which was the system that they built in to make sure no one person or one branch of government has too much power. Okay, that was their number one goal. They could have designed the government a lot of different ways, but they did it this way for a purpose, and they put a lot of thought into it. And you think 200 and whatever years ago, 200, 2.5 centuries ago, basically, we still think they did a pretty good job. There's flaws. The world is changing. The country is changing. Maybe someday we'll have to do a total overhaul of the government. It's conceivable. But for now, this 3 branches of government still going strong if we all make it work. Okay, so let's jump in. The executive branch, last week we did the legislative branch, which was the 2 houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, the executive branch is the president, but it's a lot more than just the president. Here is a listing of the executive branch. Actually, it's the whole government, but if maybe I should have, before I cut and paste this in, you could ignore this box on the top left, the legislative branch, ignore the box on the top right, the judicial branch. Everything else, the middle box at the top, everything underneath is the executive branch. So you have the executive branch, the president, the vice president, and then the executive office of the president. And there's a lot of people that work in the White House. I think I just heard the other day on a news podcast or something. There's 2,000 people that work in the White House. Okay, the White House is a big building. There's more to it than you think. All these offices, National Security Council, Office of the United States Trade Representative, Office of National Drug Control Policy, a lot of little things. The president doesn't care about, talk to those people every single day, but they're in the White House, like literally in the White House, in the office buildings and stuff connected to it. Then under that, we have all these departments. Department of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, like the interior of the country, which is like basically land normally is what that does. Department of Defense, Department of Education, all these different departments. And then underneath, we have just independent establishments and government corporations. And these are things maybe you've heard of before. Mostly not. National Credit Union Administration, the Peace Corps, Postal Regulatory Commission, the Railroad Retirement Board. Okay, not things that are going to touch all of our lives every single day, but that is the executive branch. People work in Washington, D.C. and spread around the country. There's millions of people that work in the executive branch. Okay, if the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch executes. It's the executive branch. They execute the laws. They make them happen. So really, that's what all these things are. They take the laws as written by Congress and they make them real. Okay, how's this going to work? There's a new law. What is this going to mean in people's lives? Who's going to enforce it? Do we need like other regulations to make this work? Okay, that's what the executive branch does. Um, okay, each of these departments have a person at the top, a secretary, and not like an office secretary, but like the Secretary of Defense is the highest up person in that department. All those secretaries, I think there's 17 or something, plus the vice president, plus the joint chiefs of staff, which is like the leaders of the top leaders of the military, a bunch of other people make up a group that advises the president. What do we call that group? Anybody know?
I am aware of the group, but I'm not quite sure their names.
I don't know either.
It's not, it's another word that generally you wouldn't think means this. It's the president's cabinet, right?
Right.
Probably heard of the president's cabinet. It's all those super high up people, like the tippy top people of every department and other things like the military,
Right.
and the vice president, the attorney general, all the super high up people. It used to be only a couple. Now the number of people that are qualified to be on the president's cabinet just keeps getting more and more. It might even be like 30 or 40 people. But it's the tippy top people of the executive branch. They make up the president's cabinet. And he has cabinet meetings sometimes with all of them. Sometimes it's televised and pictures. Sometimes I assume not. And, sometimes he convenes a meeting of all those people and sometimes just some of them to discuss things that come up. So that's the president's cabinet. That's the executive branch. Okay. Constitutional duties of the president. Now, this is from the Constitution, and we've looked a little bit at the Constitution. We know that it's very broad. It's very somewhat vague, right? It's open to some interpretation, and that's what the courts are for. But these are the things that the Constitution says. This is Article 2 of the Constitution. It says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And they said that because that was a new thing. Like basically, that's a new invention for the world at that time in 1787. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. He shall have power now this says, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. He shall nominate and, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other ministers, consuls, judges of the Supreme Court. So whenever there's a Supreme Court vacancy, we're going to talk about the Supreme Court in a second. When a Supreme Court justice dies or retires, because they serve for life, but they can choose to retire whenever they want. If there's an opening on the Supreme Court, it has to be filled. It is the president's job to nominate somebody for the Supreme Court and hundreds of other judges, federal judges across the country, and ambassadors, our ambassador to Australia, our ambassador to Russia. The president appoints those people by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. We're going to talk about checks and balances in a minute. The Senate has to say yes or no, has to approve of the president's nominations for these things. So they're all holding hands. The three branches of government are all holding hands. They can't do something without the other branches cooperating or doing sometimes a part of that process, the nomination of a Supreme Court justice. In the Constitution, it says, he shall from time to time give the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Now, this is a little bit interesting. We have the State of the Union address the president gives every January. But if you think back historically, what must this have looked like? Today everything's televised on 1 million TV stations, right? And you see the State of the Union address, and you don't even have to read. You don't even have to watch it because you're going to find out about it in the news some other way. Back then, they felt that it was an important enough idea to say, hey, once a year, well, they say from time to time, So they don't even say once a year. It just became once a year. The president would go in front of Congress live and give a speech saying basically what's going on in the country and what it says, recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. So the president is making a recommendation to Congress. Hey, I think we ought to think about this. I think we ought to work on this problem. Okay. Think of a picture the world back in the day when that was important enough for them to write into the Constitution. You know, now everybody's just a click away. Just send an email, fly across the country or whatever, whenever you need. But back then, they needed to make it a rule that the president needs to come talk to Congress every once in a while. So it's just interesting when they wrote it, they were working in one world, and now we're living in a very different world. And lastly, it says, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's all from the Constitution. So when people say constitutional duties, they mean, what are the things said in the Constitution? There's a lot more to the job today that we've kind of tacked on to the position of president. But these are the constitutional duties. It's not very much. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's quite big. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's a huge job, an endless job. But today through tradition and one president following the precedent of a previous president, the presidency has evolved. Everything in our country has evolved over time. Okay. So that's the executive branch. The judicial branch. If the legislative branch makes the laws and the executive branch executes or enforces the laws, the judicial branch, people say, interprets the laws. Okay, so Congress makes a new law. Well, once the executive branch works out the details and this law goes out, it takes effect, it's going to hit people's lives in different ways. It's up to the court system when somebody feels that they've been wronged. It goes into civil court. If somebody feels that something criminal has happened, if somebody's broken the law, then it goes to a criminal court. And that can be, starts at the local level, your county courthouse. And then there are different levels it's like a layer cake. There's different levels of the court system. At the top is the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about that in a second. But across the country, there's 94 federal district courts. There's 3 in Pennsylvania. So here's a map of the 3 different Pennsylvania district courts, and they all have numbers. Well, no, maybe they don't. This is the Western District of Pennsylvania, the Middle District of Pennsylvania, the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. A big one you hear about in the news sometimes is the Southern District of New York, SDNY, the Southern District of New York, because it has Manhattan in it, where like all those big companies are. That's a pretty important federal court. A lot of laws get broken there and a lot of big companies. And so when the Southern District of New York makes a ruling, it can affect the people across the country. If that company has headquarters in Manhattan, in that district. So there's 94 district courts. There's 13 federal circuit courts. Most of these have panels of judges, 3, 5, some 7 judges that hear cases, make a ruling. Now, if you are in court, even for a traffic ticket in your county courthouse, if you don't like the way your case turned out, or you feel you've been wronged in that trial in some way, or something went wrong with the trial, if you feel that you're not happy with the outcome, you can appeal the ruling. What happens when you appeal a ruling in a court case?
Are you asking what does that mean, or what happens after you appeal?
Yeah, like what does that mean? Well, kind of both. What happens what does it mean to appeal? What happens?
I believe it's to say that you believe that the ruling was unfair or was not done as you wished,
Hmm.
and then it would go up to a higher court.
Exactly. Okay.
Um, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So it goes up a level, right?
Mhm.
That they then sometimes they retry the case. They call the witnesses. They look at the evidence. Sometimes they don't. They just take all. There's papers. In a court case, the judge makes a ruling and writes basically an essay, kind of, with their opinion. Sometimes that higher court, they're not going to call you in. They're not going to call the witnesses. They're not going to do the whole thing, although sometimes they do. They may just look at the ruling from that previous judge, depending on why you're appealing, I suppose. And they say, okay, well, we disagree with this interpretation of this law. Or, maybe sometimes some new evidence comes out. If it's a murder case, maybe there's now new DNA evidence, and they look at that and they say, yeah, this should be overturned. If the higher court, no matter what level it is, if the higher court overturns it, then it changes the ruling. It takes effect. So you have 94 district courts, you have 13 federal circuit courts, and then above them you have the United States Supreme Court. Oh, I see. Hi, Marcia. Thank you for logging in. Oh, it looks like you need to mute yourself a little bit. But thanks for logging in. I need to maybe I need to change my settings so that people don't have to wait. Can I ask, how long were you waiting to get kicked into the room here?
5 minutes.
Oh, were you? Okay. Well, sorry about that. I need to change that because I didn't see on my screen that you were waiting. I apologize. So we are talking today about the three branches of government. We talked about the legislative branch. We talked about the executive branch. Now we just started talking about the judicial branch. Okay. So thanks for logging in. I will share with you the information for this course and last week's recording, and you'll get caught up. I'll share that information with you after class. So the Supreme Court, today there are 9 justices, and there's one chief justice, the top, kind of the leader. And sometimes that leadership role really matters, but most of the time there's 9 justices. They all vote. The chief justice's vote counts as one, just like everybody else's. These are the Supreme Court justices today. In the middle, seated, is John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts. The tall 2 men in the back are the 2 nominations by President Trump. Okay, so this is the 9-person Supreme Court today. The Constitution doesn't say it has to be 9. It's been up to 12 before, I think. But generally, it's an odd number. Why would you want it to be an odd number?
There's not a 50-50 decision on a case.
Right. So there's not a tie. Maybe you've heard of justices being called the swing vote or the swing justice. That means if you line them all up by their beliefs, conservatives on the one side, liberals on the left-hand side. Some people, might be a little more conservative, a little more liberal, maybe really conservative, really liberal. So if you lined them up, if there would always be one, that middle person is the swing justice. Meaning historically, there's usually one justice that sometimes votes with this group, the conservative group, sometimes votes with the liberal group. The conservatives, if you're a true conservative, you really hold those beliefs, you're always going to stick together. And there may be 2, 3, 4 of them. If you're really liberal, you really believe in liberal views of things, you're always going to vote liberal. 2, 3, 4 of them stick together. But sometimes, quite often in history, there's somebody stuck in the middle who sometimes sees things this way, sometimes sees things that way. They're called a swing vote. And they're the people that can really be persuaded. Other people are so hard, you know, these other justices are so fixed in their views that they can't be persuaded. But that's when there is a swing vote justice, that can be a pretty big deal. So it says 9 justices, one chief justice. They're appointed for life. They're appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. What they say goes. It is the law of the land, the ultimate law of the land. There's about 1,000 cases that appeal to the Supreme Court every year, and they only accept and hear 100 of them about. So lots of cases try to go to the Supreme Court, you know, get to that level, but then the Supreme Court says, no, we're not gonna take up that issue. So when that happens, the lower court, whatever that ruling is, stands. That's the end of it. When they do take up a case, they take up about 180 to 100 cases a year. They're not calling in witnesses and saying, where were you? Where were you when this murder happened? They take up cases that are big issues, okay? They're not here to determine who stole whose wallet. They're here to determine what is the meaning of this ruling, okay? So one really good example that I had a few years ago, I can't remember when it was, but maybe you remember hearing in the news, the Colorado baker, I used to remember the names, don't remember all the details, but there was a baker in Colorado who held certain religious views and refused to make a wedding cake for a gay couple that came in. Okay, they came in, just wanted business. This was, when gay marriage was now legal. They weren't breaking any laws, and they wanted a wedding cake. The shop owner refused to do that for them. So I can't remember who sued who. I think they sued the shop owner, saying, we have a right, we're not breaking any laws, we have a right to get his business. And he said he had a right to refuse their business. These are both First Amendment issues. We looked last week at the First Amendment. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That's a complicated issue. Who's right? Both of them have good, strong arguments. Now you may feel this way or that way, but both are making valid points. It went up to the Supreme Court, I believe, and I should know the details, but the Supreme Court makes a ruling. They take all of, and of course these people are experts, obviously, and they look at all the laws, they look at similar court rulings, and they cook it all together in their brains, and they go back and they're discussing things with their colleagues. The justices are discussing things with each other, and they say, okay, this is a big issue that will, whatever we say here is going to affect businesses and people's lives nationwide. So that's what the Supreme Court is for. It's called the process of judicial review. They review the laws. They review how the laws are being enforced. Whose rights are more important in that case, the baker or the couple? And they make the tough decisions. So it says, through the process of judicial review, the court has the authority to interpret the Constitution and declare a law or government action unconstitutional if it violates the spirit of the Constitution. So sometimes people come and say, this law is wronging me in some way. Or some people say, a government action has wronged me in some way. And so that, if you're lucky, you get to the Supreme Court and they're here. If it's a big issue, these are not, they don't hear tiny little cases about people committing crimes. These are big issues. They need to interpret the laws in very broad ways. Okay. Which brings us to checks and balances. This is the spirit of the Constitution, of these 3 branches of government. We have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Each one has roles, has duties that involves the other 2 branches. Okay, so let's just look at some examples. In in the blue. The president is the commander-in-chief who can veto bills, recommend. So veto bills, what does it mean to veto a bill?
To disapprove of a bill that the legislative government creates.
Right. It's the president. The president vetoes. Nobody else vetoes. That's when the president vetoes something. Congress passes a law. It's not law. They pass a bill. The bill doesn't become law until the president signs it. If the president vetoes it, it means he rejects it. Okay. So let's say the president vetoes a bill. In the red, you see the legislative branch, Congress, can override a presidential veto. They pass a bill, a new law they want, goes to the president. He says, nope, I don't agree with that for whatever reason. He vetoes it. It goes back to Congress. They can override the veto if they have, I think, a 2/3 majority vote, maybe 3/4. I think 2/3. If their beliefs are strong enough, if enough, let's say, senators feel that this is proper, and if they get enough votes, over 2/3, then they can ignore, overrule, overpower the president's veto. But if not enough senators think that it's a big deal, if not enough think that it's important, then they don't get, they fail to override the veto, and the president's veto stands. Let's see what else. He can recommend legislation, call special sessions of Congress. From the legislative branch controlling, checking the executive branch, we can override presidential veto. They control appropriations. They call that the power of the purse. The legislative branch has the power of the purse. They hold the money. They pass the budget, although the president's now involved in the budget process too. But the legislative branch passes the budget. They say, we're going to give $1 million to this and $5 million to that. Okay. The executive branch doesn't get to decide, doesn't get to apportion out that money. They get to then spend the money, but only when the legislative branch says they have the money. Okay. If the legislative branch cuts something out of the budget, then that thing ceases to exist. Nobody can work on that anymore because they're not funding it anymore. The legislative branch gets to pick that. They can refuse the president's appointments. They can vote down. It happens all the time. They vote down somebody that the president has nominated for something. They can impeach and remove the president from office. The judicial branch can rule that the presidential action is unconstitutional. Judges appointed by the president serve for life. Now that's a check and balance because they're never worrying about re-election. They shouldn't be worried about keeping anybody happy except following the Constitution, interpreting the Constitution and the laws as wisely as they can. They're never running for re-election. They're appointed for life. That's a way to check and balance the power. The president appoints them, but then they serve for life. So they could say, hey, president, I don't agree with you anymore. Sometimes these people are justices or judges for decades. Sometimes their views change over time. The country has changed and their views change. Sometimes presidents say, hey, I nominated that guy 10 years ago, but I don't agree with everything he's doing. That's the way the system works. The president can grant reprieves and pardons, which basically he can make, he can nullify something from the judicial system. And President Trump has pardoned lots of people. Presidents, they pardon a lot of people. It is when the president feels the judicial system has made a mistake, essentially, that's the purpose of it. When he says there's been a mistake made, I'm going to pardon this person, which if they've gone to jail, they get right out of jail that day. Their record is clean. That's his way of balancing the power of the judicial branch. let's see, how do the judicial branch and legislative branch, they can declare laws unconstitutional. Um, the legislative branch can propose constitutional amendments to overrule Supreme Court decisions. We talked last week about how difficult it is to do a constitutional amendment, but if it's a good enough idea and enough of the country is behind that idea, they can make it happen. Okay, so checks and balances are really important. It's not uncommon on the GED test and HiSET test to see a chart like this with the three branches of government. And they say, well, the president can do this. What can the legislative branch do to balance that power? So that's not uncommon. Okay, checks and balances are important. And without, you take away some of those powers, and one of those three branches of government would probably become too powerful without being kind of knocked back, controlled a little bit by the other two branches. So any questions on the checks and balances? Any questions at all? Okay. All right, now, big part of the HiSET and GED test is graphics. So check this graphic out, okay? You gotta know, you gotta be able to see something like this and make sense of it. So first thing you do, you read the title, which I have probably a little bit hidden up there. Election results from 1788 to 2012 showing percentage of popular vote. Okay, look at the bottom, it's years, every 4 years for a presidential election. It doesn't say presidential election, but that's what it is. Okay. What are the colors? What do the colors represent?
Political parties.
Different political parties. You see the colors change over time. There have been more political parties than just the two that we have now. Over time, the political parties change. This line across the middle is 50%. Okay, we're going to talk in a moment. The next slide is the electoral college of how the president is elected. But this is the electoral or the election results over almost everything up until through 2012, showing the percentage of popular vote. So let's see something interesting. There's plenty of years. Oh, and so the white names we can deduce is the president, the winner of that election, right? So let's say 1932, 1930s and 40s, you have the Great Depression. 1929, you have the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Through the 1930s, Great Depression. 1941 is World War II. So you have World War II start. Through all of that is FDR, Roosevelt, Frederick D. Roosevelt. He won, he was elected 4 times. Now he died in office the fourth time, but he was president, he was elected 4 times. Now today, since right after that, I think 1951, we looked at it last week, they passed a constitutional amendment, I forget the number, saying the president can only serve 2 terms. They had President Roosevelt for 4 terms, 3 and a little bit because he died in office. And they said, oh, you know what? That's a little bit too much like having a king. He gained a little bit too much power. The country got a little bit too comfortable with one person at the top for so long. They said, let's make a rule here. You can't serve more than 2 terms. So that's what it was. That's why Roosevelt was there. And it just so happened that nobody else had served more than 2 terms. Okay. Then you have Roosevelt died in office, leads to Truman. Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson takes over. Okay. Clinton serves 2 terms. George Bush serves 2 terms. Obama serves 2 terms. And then you have the 2016 isn't shown. Okay. So this is a good graphic. It's not actually all that complicated once you look at it. There's some useful information. The stars show an election won without a plurality of the popular vote. Okay, now let's look at those. And what was that? 1876, Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. We have a star. He wins, and yet look, red is less than 50%. This line is 50%. We have less than 50% of the popular, meaning the people's vote. When you and I vote, it's the popular vote. It happens again in 1888 with Harrison. Gets less than the other person. Right? They don't say who it is, but he has less than the other person. Hayes has less, red is less than blue. It happens again with George W. Bush in 2000. Red, he receives less of the nation's votes than, who was that in 2000?
Al Gore.
Yeah, Al Gore.
Yeah.
It happened in 2016. Donald Trump received less of the popular vote than Hillary Clinton. So what we're going to look at now is, how did those people then become president? When you and I go to vote on election day, we cast our votes. They are not meaningless, okay? People say, well, I'm just, what does my vote matter? And yeah, it's one vote out of millions, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. If everybody viewed it that way, then nobody would vote and it would matter quite a lot. So setting aside that argument that my vote doesn't matter, what doesn't happen is everybody in the country votes and whoever gets the most votes wins. That's how kids think it works. A lot of people think that that's how it should work, but that's not how it works. In the Constitution, they set up the Electoral College. So here's the Electoral College. Okay. Each state has a certain number of electors, and these are actual people. And the Electoral College, it's not a college like for education, but just a group. It's a group of actual people, and they get together usually in December to cast their votes for president. But by that time, we already know, generally, every time, we know who's already won. Because, first line, it says the popular vote within each state decides who that state's electors will vote for. So here, this is up-to-date information. This gray is how many electors each state has. Pennsylvania has 20. Other states are far fewer, right? You live out in the Dakotas, you have 3. You live in Montana, you have 3. But we talked last week about California has 55 electors. By far the most in the country. New York, 29, Florida, 29, Texas, there's a lot of people, 38. Okay, so each state has a number of electors equal to their number of senators, 2, plus their members of Congress. So setting aside those 2 senators from every state, the Electoral College is spread out among the country by population. Pennsylvania is a very important state. What are we, tied for 5th? We got 55, 38, 29, 29. And then Pennsylvania and Illinois have 20. So we're tied for 5th most votes. People running for president care about us in Pennsylvania because here's the thing. I'll go and vote on election day. Somebody in Montana is going to go vote on election day. If I cast a vote for person A and they cast a vote for person A, my vote, I'm sorry to say, my vote in Pennsylvania matters more than their vote in where did I say? Montana, where they have 3 to our 20. Okay. If given the choice between winning the state, getting the most votes in each state of Pennsylvania or Montana, Donald Trump's going to pick Pennsylvania because he would get, if he wins the majority vote in Pennsylvania, he gets 20 Electoral College votes. Now, it takes 270 to win the Electoral College. It's 538 is the number of electors. So the majority of that is 270. If you get 270 total Electoral College votes, you win the presidency. Okay. So this is, on the right-hand side, red and blue, this is the 2016 results. Hillary Clinton got 232 Electoral College votes. She got California, 55. California is very heavily Democrat. Doesn't mean it's all Democrat, but in the election, in California, there was more Democrats than Republicans. So California goes Democrat, 55 votes to Hillary Clinton. New York, a lot of New England, you can see is all blue. Their state by state majorities ended up going to Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump wins. A lot of the middle of the country tends to be majority Republican, and he won a few very what they call swing states. We talked about swing justices. Swing states are states where like it's really 50-50. Okay, Pennsylvania plenty of times has sent their electors and voted for a Democrat, plenty of times. Last time, Trump won Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania popular vote, so he got those 20 electoral college votes. This time again, Pennsylvania could go either way. Wisconsin is the same way, Florida is the same way, North Carolina is the same way. It's very close 50-50. It's hard to predict which way that state, the majority of people in that state are going to go. And so those are the nail biters. Those are the things we're going to watch in the election. Okay. So the Electoral College. So now, okay, so people wonder, well, how can, if Hillary Clinton got more of the people's vote across the country as a whole, how did she not win the Electoral College? It goes state by state. Okay. Let's say every person, millions of people in California voted for Hillary Clinton. Let's say every person who lives in California, every single one votes for Hillary Clinton. That's a lot of votes. But it doesn't change the fact that she would get only those 55 Electoral College votes. So there were more people in the country that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but it doesn't matter across the country. It matters within each state. And then whoever wins the majority within each state gets that state's number of electors, and you add up, and Hillary Clinton got 232, Trump got 306. Okay. It's confusing. It's weird. It's not what we're all taught as kids. We think that that's not how you win elections. You win elections by people voting, and whoever has the most votes wins the election, right? But what we don't explain to small children is that the Electoral College works a little bit differently. So this can be tough. Any questions? And I think this year it's important for everybody to be clear on it. Any questions on how the Electoral College works?
I don't have a question about the process for presidential election, but why is the Electoral College specifically for the presidential nomination and not for any other federal government positions?
Well, good question. That's because I heard this in the past year or two, and I never really thought of it. The president is the only person that everybody in the country is voting on. You know, we'll go to the polls on election day, or if you're doing mail-in ballot, you see your mail-in ballot, and there's a bunch of names on it. The only name that appears on every ballot across the country, or even in Ohio, the only people that me and the folks in Ohio are voting on together is the presidency. The president is the only national position. If you think about it, it's the only position in the whole government that everybody in the country comes to vote on. Everybody else on your ballot is a state senator, a state representative, local people. So my ballot and the person's ballot in Ohio are totally different, except for the names at the top that we're voting on for president. So yes, the Electoral College only applies to the presidency. Okay. A lot of people don't think it's fair. And here's an interesting factoid. And I've heard it in a few places. I've never tracked it down to see exactly the details. But by 2040, in 20 years, 70% of the country's population is going to live in just 15 of the 50 states. 50% of the population, 50% of Americans will live in just 8 different states. Probably California, probably all the ones with the big numbers there. California, New York City, Pennsylvania has a lot of people, Illinois, Florida, Texas. Okay. 50% of the country's people will live in just 8 states, which means if you split the country in 50%, if those 50% of the people all vote for the same person for president, and the other part of the country votes, the other part of that, the other 50% votes for the other person for president, you're going to have 8 states versus 42 states, which is not how I think our founding fathers viewed this playing out. Okay, they lived in a world before big cities. Next week, we'll talk about some more history. Industrialization with big cities, skyscrapers, big factories didn't exist when they wrote the Constitution. They were all farmers. Some of them were slaveholders, right? So they lived in a world where everybody was a farmer. Of course, people are going to be spread out. Of course, you need to represent small populations of people. But by 2040, 50% of the country's population is going to live in 8 states. And the other 42 states, the balance of power is going to shift. So maybe we're in for some changes here. Maybe this system that we have, they wrote the Constitution. Maybe we're gonna have to find different ways to govern fairly. The Electoral College, a lot of people like it, a lot of people don't. I'd say more people don't than do. Few people are saying, yes, the Electoral College is exactly how things should work. But I don't see that changing anytime soon because, I mean, it would take a constitutional amendment. And those are very difficult. So any questions on how it works or why, any questions about the Electoral College? Okay. Well, then let's jump in here. We got 10 minutes. I do like to stick to the schedule of noon. Let's talk a little bit about history. Okay. So we're going to hit the high points of history. This is the Wright brothers in 1903. People focus on presidents and wars for history, and we will as well in the next few minutes. But, I think what's interesting is what I like to learn when I read history and read articles and things. I like to see how do people live back in 1903, right? So here's the Wright brothers flying their airplane in 1903. I like to see regular people's lives. You get the big inventions, you get, sports and stuff like that. And when you zoom in on people's lives, I think that's what's interesting. Now, that's not what's going to be on the GED test and the HiSET test. You want to be familiar with the wars and the big trends and not so much the presidents and, there's not particularly any dates. But that's why I put that picture up there anyway. So let's look at a timeline. Okay, now I know some of this is kind of small, but we go from 1600 to 2000, beyond 2000. Last week we talked about Jamestown in 1607 or 1608. You have the Mayflower landing, the Pilgrims landing in Massachusetts in 1620. And so we have British colonial period. Lasts a long time. Okay. The British colonies existed for most of 200 years. That's a long time of very slowly changing history. Then you have the American Revolution. We have the Articles of Confederation government, which didn't last long, but then, of course, right after that, they changed it by passing the Constitution. We got a couple of wars, the Mexican-American War. We will talk soon about expansion. How did we get from those 13 colonies, became 13 states on the East Coast, how do we get across to California and the West Coast? That expansion we'll talk about. So, and the Mexican-American War was part of it. The Civil War, we'll talk about. The Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, we'll touch on. You have World War I, World War II. Oh, World War II. World War I, you have the Great Depression. We'll touch on that when we talk a little bit about economics. World War II, the Cold War. We'll talk about the Cold War. It's not a war per se, but it's more of an era. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. And now we've got our ongoing involvement in the Middle East, the war in Afghanistan from 2001. And it's a messy, complicated situation that's, in some version is continuing to the present. So that's just a quick timeline. I will share this with you. You can look at this, and it's not important to memorize dates, but I think it's good I like a visualization to see, okay, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And these things were happening at the same time on the timeline. Okay, so let's cover a little bit more ground here. So we talked about last week the Revolutionary War and the founding era. Kind of the gateway separating the colonial period with what we would call the United States of America, the new country, was the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1776, written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, who's here, has kind of reddish hair, ruddy hair, here wearing a red vest, tall guy. Written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, and it says that the British were not fair in their rule over the American colonies, and it declared the 13 colonies to be an independent nation, the United States of America. So that's, as we talked about last week, the Declaration of Independence. And here's a painting painted later. Each of these is a person from different states. This is all, these faces represent actual people. Okay, here's Benjamin Franklin, maybe you recognize him. This short guy, I think, is James, that's probably John Adams. Okay, so this is a famous painting, lots of famous people. So Revolutionary War and the founding era, they founded the country. Okay, let's talk about three important people. George Washington, and this is, top to bottom. George Washington, you know him from your $1 bills. Before they made him president, he was a general in the colonial army, what they called the Continental Army, fighting the British. They did the Articles of Confederation, which did not have, as we talked about last week, didn't have a strong central government, didn't have a president. It was not the three branches that we know today. But then that didn't work, so they rewrote the plan, came up with the Constitution, three branches of the government, and he was elected the first president, served for 2 terms. He was very popular, and we look to President Washington. He set a lot of traditions in government and the presidency. What is that job? He was the first person to hold the job. He created a lot of those roles. Okay, George Washington. They say he wasn't a particularly good general, but he was loved as a president and respected. People at the time respected him. Okay, then you have Thomas Jefferson, number 2. He's on, I think Jefferson's on, is he on a $5 bill? No, Lincoln's on the $5. Jefferson's on a $20 bill, I think. Right? Is that Jefferson? He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was America's 3rd president. Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, you want to remember the Declaration of Independence for Jefferson. James Madison was America's 4th president, but doesn't get as much love as the other guys. He was called the father of the Constitution because he was the one who wrote much of it out. They were a whole group of people were coming up with the ideas, but Madison wrote much of the text of the Constitution. He was the writer for it. So you have Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. Okay, let's talk about this and then maybe we'll be done. Okay, so you have a young country, and this is an exciting period of history to think about. You have a young country there, 1780s, 1790s, you have Washington being president. Thomas Jefferson is president number 3, and they make the Louisiana Purchase. Who did they purchase? So outlined in purple on the map here is the Louisiana Purchase. He bought millions of acres paid money for it. The United States paid money to buy land. Who did they buy that from? Anybody know? Who were the other?
Spanish.
No, not the Spanish. Although the Spanish, that the kind of tan area on the left, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, that is Spanish territory. But the Louisiana Purchase wasn't Spanish territory. Who else is involved in North America, do you think?
France.
It was France. It was France. So, you know, back when America was just these orange states, okay, the original colonies, plus you have Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio joins in 1803. They're adding new states. The gray is territories. When they have land, but it's not quite a state yet, it's territories. You have Michigan territory, Indiana territory, Illinois territory, Mississippi territory. And they're expanding westward. There's a continent. Okay, Canada is forming to the north. Mexico is forming from the Spanish in the south. Okay, but they don't know that. That's not all decided yet. They're expanding westward. So Jefferson sees an opportunity to purchase all this land that's owned by Louisiana. I forget the king, the Spanish or the French king. He buys the Louisiana territory. They call it the Louisiana Territory, the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. Then he sends out, maybe you've heard of Lewis and Clark. They send out Lewis and Clark to explore that land. That was their job, to explore the land of the Louisiana Territory. This painting is a famous painting, comes later, 1872, but it's the idea of manifest destiny. Okay. Manifest destiny is the idea that, okay, here's a bunch of land. It is America's destiny that our country will expand across North America and reach the Pacific Ocean. They didn't know how, they didn't know exactly, you know, this is French territory, then this is all Spanish territory. Up here, Oregon is, they argued with British if it belonged to it, who it belonged to. They didn't know how it was going to happen, but they felt very confident that someday the United States of America would expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They felt that it was their manifest destiny. Okay, manifest, like made real, kind of it's a tough term, tough word, but it was their destiny to expand the country. And so this painting is kind of like the spirit of America, and they're sweeping across, and you see the trains progress. The spirit lady is, what is she holding? What is she putting down behind her?
It's a cable of some sort.
What would be the
That's
technology back then? What is the communication technology back then?
telegraph.
Maybe telegraph, yeah. It's not telephone. They don't have the telephone yet. Telegraph with Morse code, yeah. So this painting is showing the expansion. Okay, you got the Rocky Mountains, you got Native Americans, you got buffaloes. Of course, the buffaloes are running away. The Native Americans are running away. You have farmers. Okay, so they're expanding. This is hopeful. This is a happy. They feel that it is their God-given right to expand. And they'll deal with the Indians in their own way, bad ways mostly. But, you know, the Indians will be in their way, and they'll handle the Indians somehow, the Native Americans, but they felt that it was their destiny to expand westward. So we have the westward expansion period. This is really through the 1800s. I went to look, and I went to copy and paste a list of when each of the 50 states became states, but I couldn't make it work on the slide, and the numbers were too small. But anyway, you could look it up. It happens through the 1800s. From 1800 to 1900, all the states except, I think, except Hawaii and Alaska. I think all the other 40 states came into existence, became part of the country from 1800 to 1900. So we call that period the westward expansion. Okay. Obviously, everything else is happening too. in the history of the country. But that's that period, the westward expansion. Okay. So we can stop there. So next week we're going to talk about the Civil War, Abe Lincoln. We'll talk about Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War. Talk about World War I briefly, World War II. We'll talk about the Cold War. Okay. So we'll talk about some things. Next week we'll dive into American history and keep the ball rolling. I will share this I'll share this the recording with you. I'll share this document with you. Now keep in mind when you look at it, we've not looked at all of this, and it disappeared from me. You know, we haven't looked at everything, and we got to keep moving quickly. So I just want to touch on the biggest ideas. But I think what we'll do, I'd like to zoom through, and we may have to go fast, but between next week and the week after, we'll discuss at a very fast pace most of American history, and we will cover some geography, and we'll cover some economics. Economics and geography are not the most important topics on the GED or HiSET test. We will touch on the big ideas like supply and demand and some things like that. But we can go through those pretty quickly. We'll look at some examples. We'll look at some charts. But civics and government is about 50% of the test. Okay, so like 50% of the questions, the readings you look at, the graphs you look at, 50% of them on both the HiSET and the GED are civics and government. So that, which makes sense because we want everybody to know about how the government works. History is important. History's there as well, is a big portion of it. So we'll talk about the high points, the most important, biggest parts of American history. And then we'll touch on geography. We'll touch on economics. I think we will squeeze this into 4 weeks, which, as I said at the beginning of last week, my goal is to make this a 4-week class. Then if you want to come on week 5, you may, but you're going to be hearing week 1 stuff again. So we're doing something new. We're trying this out. Make it a 4-week class that repeats for new people who sign up every time. If you want to keep coming, you're absolutely welcome to. Okay, so covered a lot, a little bit afternoon. Any questions about anything we talked about? Oh, we got some in the chat. Oh, is Thomas Jefferson on the $2 bill? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, yeah. I have seen $2 bills. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jefferson's on the nickel. Yeah, okay. That's interesting. I've seen $2 bills. I used to have a friend who every time we would travel a little bit together, actually for coaching sports, every time we go into a restaurant, he would always tip with a $2 bill. And people look at you weird. They're like, is that real money? But like, some people don't want it because they don't think it's real money, but it is real money. But when it was a waitress or a waiter, if it was a younger person, they would always be real excited because they'd see a $2 bill. It'd be like it's something rare. You can walk into the bank and ask for $2 bills. But yeah, I guess Jefferson's on the $2 bill. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot. Finished up the government, started the history. Any questions at all?
Nope.
Okay. Marcia, I'll get your email from our system and I will send you the information. I'll get you on board. So yeah, thanks everybody. I'll share this later today or tomorrow. So yeah, have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
You too.
Thank
You
you.
too.
All right, thank you.
Have a great day.